And we're back with Mark. Throughout this gospel, we have already seen several miracles, such as the cleansing of the leper, the lifting of the paralytic, and most recently, the restoration of a man's withered hand. These have all been types in one form or another for the bruises and breaches of Israel being healed through the reconciliation of the Christ. In the previous passage, we explored how the rejuvenation of a dried up hand foreshadowed the gradual restoration of the dry olive tree of Israel. And now as we continue, we see several branches of that same tree from across the Jordan, from Tyre and Sidon and elsewhere, coming to reach out and be healed the same. We will take time in this commentary to discuss those places because just as it is beneficial to understand the backdrop of Judean politics and the sons of Herod, as in the previous commentary, it is also important to understand Judean geography and the Israelite sons of the land. Continuing with Mark. Mark chapter 3, verses 7 to 12. And Yahshua withdrew to the sea with his students, and a great multitude from Galilee followed. And from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and across the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude hearing what things he does came to him. And he spoke to his students, in order that a boat should be waiting ready for him, for reason that the crowd would crush him. For he had healed many, so as to fall upon him as many as had afflictions, in order that they may touch him. And the unclean spirits, when they saw him, fell before him and cried out, saying, that you are the Son of Yahweh. And he admonished them often, that they should not make him known. This account is also recorded at Matthew 12, verses 15 to 21, and Luke 6, verses 17 to 19. Now, it could be argued that Matthew's account of this event is actually at Matthew 4:25, because there it adjoins the Sermon on the Mount, just as the account does in Luke 6. However, they may be similar, but they do seem to be separate occurrences, because this account also follows Matthew's of the man with the withered hand. I would say it's more likely to be parallel to Matthew 12 than Matthew 4. Now, this pericope is quite simple, but has slight differences in thematic intention between each gospel. In Matthew, the healing of the multitude is just briefly glanced over, with the focus being on the fulfillment of the words of Isaiah the prophet, and that citation is not made in the other gospels. We don't see it in Luke, and we don't see it here in Mark. And then, while Luke and Mark share many similarities between them, Luke's account is comparatively concise. It's economic with its wording compared to the oral gospel. In the oral gospel of Mark, the account is longest and, unsurprisingly, most evocative, with a small handful of unique details as well. As always, we will now examine the account one verse at a time. Mark 3:7. And Yahshua withdrew to the sea with his students, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and from Judea. In my opinion, it's not the best verse division, but we'll get to that later. Now, we can logically assume that Yahshua withdrew because his enemies had intentions to harm him, and that rationale is confirmed in Matthew's Gospel, where the apostle writes, quote, "But knowing that the Pharisees and Herodians were taking murderous counsel, but knowing it, Yahshua withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all." It is not evident whether or not the Pharisees and Herodians were capable of immediately fulfilling their murderous counsel, but the threat was apparently enough for Yahshua to depart from the town, or at least that was the perception of the apostles who witnessed these things. We have to take that into account. When we read in the gospel that Yahshua did this for this reason, that might have just been the apostles' perception of why he made that choice, right? A regular lesson of the gospel accounts is that Yahshua's enemies were never able to seize him until the hour came, the hour when he willingly gave himself up as a ransom for his people. Because as he said, quote, "No one takes it from me. Rather, I lay it down by myself. One example of a failed seizure is in the Gospel of John, where we read, quote, "Then they sought to seize him, yet no one laid a hand upon him, because his hour had not yet come." So the counsel of the Pharisees and Herodians was, of course, vanity, for Joshua still had work to do, confirming the covenant with many for 1 week, just as Daniel prophesied, and performing the works for which he was sent, as he says in the Gospel. For example, John 4:34, 9:4, etc. Now, the departure from Capernaum to the Sea of Galilee would have been a short journey, 5 to 10 minutes, if the modern identification of Capernaum is correct, the site where archaeologists esteem to be the location of ancient Capernaum. With such a modest withdrawal, it might appear that Joshua was barely leaving the reach of his enemies. But it is possible that he continued down the coast for some distance, since there is no telling how far distant from Capernaum the mountain was where he named his apostles. Right after this account in Mark, Joshua ascends into the mountain where he names his apostles. That mountain was in Galilee. We know that from Matthew. It's also sequenced in that way in Luke as well. So if that mountain, we don't know where it was in Galilee. There's no way to know. As far as I know, that mountain in Galilee, that could have been, we have no idea how close that was to Capernaum. If it was pretty far away from Capernaum, then yes, Joshua made quite some journey down the coast. The Gospels are abbreviated. Regardless if he was close to Capernaum or not, the crowds which followed him would have served as a considerable buffer against any foes attempting an arrest. And there is a record of such a situation later in the Gospels, where Matthew writes, quote, "And seeking to seize him, they feared the crowds, since they esteemed him to be a prophet." Anything the Pharisees or Herodians would have attempted, they would have had to go through the crowd. That would have been difficult for them. There's a reason Joshua ultimately was arrested when he was alone with his apostles in the garden. Now, speaking of those who followed Joshua, Mark alone takes time to note that a multitude from Galilee followed him out of Capernaum. That might seem unnecessary to mention since Capernaum was in Galilee. But those Galileans would have, of course, exceeded just the residents of that town, and that's implied in Mark's language. After all, Joshua had already made extensive travels throughout Galilee by this time, with reports of his deeds preceding him wherever he went. Now, it might appear in the English that a multitude from Galilee and Judea and elsewhere followed Joshua out of Capernaum. It does say here in Mark 3:7, "And Joshua withdrew to the sea with his students, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and from Judea." However, the Greek grammar implies a distinction between those from Galilee who followed Joshua out of Capernaum, because it's singular. The following there, the verb they followed, which is a kalothesin, that is in the singular, so it's just referring to the multitude from Galilee. But the broader multitude coming to him afterwards from other regions, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, across the Jordan, around Tyre and Sidon, there the verb came to him, which is elthon. That verb is in the plural. So what does this tell us? It tells us that when Joshua left Capernaum, a great multitude from Galilee followed. But then afterwards, a great multitude from these other regions, hearing what things he does, came to him. Perhaps this could be expressed with a sentence division in the English. It could read perhaps, quote, "And Joshua withdrew to the sea with his students, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, period. And from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, etc., etc." It would have been better then if the medieval verse division placed "and from Judea" in the 8th verse, and that would have made this more clear. Joshua's ministry was a phenomenon from its earliest days and was continuously growing as the influence of others steadily shrank. At least most of the portion of this multitude which witnessed a work of power in Capernaum apparently followed Joshua out from the town and did not go with the Pharisees or Herodians. That illustrates the words of the prince which we quoted in the previous commentary, where he said, when all of his own, this is the parable of the Good Shepherd in John 10, when all of his own go out, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, because they know his voice. Yet they shall not follow another, but flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers. They don't know the voice of Pharisees and Herodians. They flee from them and follow Joshua out of Capernaum instead. Okay, continuing with Mark. Mark 3:8. And from Jerusalem and from Idumea and across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude hearing what things he does came to him. The mention of Idumea and across the Jordan are unique to Mark. Idumea might appear perplexing at first. We'll get to it. The word translated as came is erkamai, Strong's 2064. And it is in the aorist tense, which implies an action which began in the past and has continuing effects into the future. So perhaps this crowd is steadily coming in. It's not immediately clear how long it took for this assembly to gather, but the distances would infer that it was at least a somewhat considerable time. Tyre and Sidon were quite far away from Capernaum, but of course we don't know when they began to set out. Perhaps they set out before Joshua even healed the man with the withered hand. Now, these people coming to Joshua, they would have been brought on by the plethora of reports which were spreading concerning the things, plural, which Joshua was doing and continuing to do in his ministry. They were hearing these reports. As it says, hearing what things he does came to him. Mark, in using the plural, refers to the quantity of reports that were spread. Thus far in Mark, we have seen the healing of the possessed man, at which time, quote, the report of it went out at once everywhere in the whole surrounding region of Galilee. And also the cleansing of the leper, who going off, quote, began to proclaim many things and to spread the account. There are other miracles which appear to have happened by this time in Joshua's ministry, but which are not recorded in Mark, such as one unique to Matthew, where 2 blind men's eyes were opened, and, quote, they, having departed, made it known in all that land, which was likely Galilee as well. These reports would have spread beyond just Galilee over time. But of course, there would have been reports spreading of many deeds not recorded in the gospel, because, as John wrote, there are also many other things Joshua had done, which if each one were written, I suppose that society itself would not have space for the books which would be written. Think of all the miracles which Joshua did, all the great deeds, and all the reports which would have spread of those deeds, which are not recorded in the gospel. Likely dozens or even hundreds. Now those miracles we referenced from Mark 1, the healing of the possessed man and the cleansing of the leper. Those miracles appear to have been centered around Galilee, also the one for Matthew as well. But reports of Joshua had spread into the borders of other regions even in the earliest days of his ministry, where after departing from Nazareth and settling in Capernaum, we read from Matthew 4:24. And the report of him had gone out into all of Syria. Moving ahead a bit, verse 25, and many crowds followed him from Galilee and Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea and beyond the Jordan. Beyond the Jordan. Just like here, near the dawn of Joshua's ministry, there were already crowds following Joshua from that place. And it's even strongly suggested in John's Gospel that Joshua was immersed in the Jordan on its other side, because that's where John was immersing around that time, so it's strongly implied. As for Judea and people hearing of Joshua from Judea and Jerusalem, well, of course, we must not forget that Joshua traveled through Judea at least 2 or 3 times a year to present himself in Jerusalem for the required feasts. so it's logical to assume that his visits to Judea were more regular than that. It's evident that both Judeans and Galileans quickly became acquainted with Yahshua in the early period of his ministry, as he even had cast out bankers in Jerusalem by this time in Mark. That is recorded in John 2, which certainly took place before Mark 3. We read in John 4, verse 45, "Therefore, when he came into Galilee, the Galileans all welcomed him, who had seen how many things he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, for they also had come to the feast." And then later, Yahshua's deeds in Galilee and Judea were brought up by the wicked high priests during his trial before Pontius Pilate, where they said, quote, "He agitates the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, even beginning from Galilee as far as here." So Yahshua would have been known far and wide. And while that may not be immediately evident here in Mark so far, or even in the other synoptic gospels, indeed, Yahshua was by this time already well known throughout Palestine, and even, as we saw in Matthew, much of Syria. And that was quite far north of Galilee. And going back for a moment to the mention of people coming from across the Jordan, Matthew's gospel could suggest that Yahshua had already made travels into places like the region of the Gadarenes by this time in the way he orders certain events. And with a 3.5-year-long ministry, that is certainly to be expected. Certainly. So he likely had gone to Decapolis and the Gadarenes and Perea by this time. These matters might not always be transparent in the narratives of the Gospels, but the Gospels are abbreviated, their accounts largely thematically arranged. What we are seeing here in Mark 3 are the effects of a famous and phenomenal ministry, with reports of Yahshua's deeds being heard of far and wide. The considerable handful of regions being named here are a demonstration of how the light of Yahshua shined brighter than John the Baptist, as after all, he was the Christ for whom John the Baptist prepared the people, the one whom John the Baptist said was greater than he. Of course. The description of John's ministry in the opening of Mark is comparatively tame compared to Mark 3 here, where Mark writes, "And all the land of Judea, and all those in Jerusalem went out to him." Matthew adds, "all the region around the Jordan." Those are only 3 places, as compared to 6 or 7 here in Mark, depending on whether or not you want to group Tyre and Sidon as a unit. As John the Baptist said concerning Christ, quote, "It is necessary for him to be augmented, and for me to be diminished." And as for Yahshua's ministry being greater than John's, well, the Apostle John even records that the Pharisees in Judea at an early time observed how Yahshua's popularity exceeded that of John's, where he writes, quote, "Therefore, as Yahshua had become aware that the Pharisees heard that, quote, Yahshua makes and immerses more students in Johannes, even though Yahshua himself is not immersed, but his students, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee." Now, to discuss something which can be gleaned for so many people coming to Christ here. In the ending of the first chapter of Mark at verse 45, we read that after the cleansing of the leper, Yahshua was unable to enter openly into the city on account of the report, and quote, "He was outside in the desert places, and they came to him from everywhere." The word translated as everywhere is Pantakathan, which implies from all quarters, as we discussed in the relevant commentary, preventing the decay. So it implied from all quarters, and here at Mark 3 verses 7 to 8, we have multitudes being drawn to Christ from all 4 directions. The land across the Jordan was to the southeast of Capernaum, and then the breadth of Galilee was to its west. Judea, Jerusalem, and Idumea, they were to the south of Capernaum, and in Tyre and Sidon, to the north. These multitudes were being gathered then from 4 quarters, and that is certainly a foreshadow of the great gathering from the 4 winds, which will occur at the second coming, as promised in the prophets and also by Christ here in this gospel, and also in Matthew's account as well, where he says, quote, "And then he shall," this is Yahshua speaking concerning his second coming, the coming of the Son of Man, quote, "And then he shall send the messengers, and they shall gather his elect out of the 4 winds." The elect, of course, are Israel. Isaiah 45:4, Israel, my elect. So at that time, all of the children of Israel will be gathered for a meeting with the prince, one by one, and without any exceptions. Even the dead will come with Yahshua when he returns. Now, as for here in Mark, many might try to argue that these weren't largely Israelites being gathered to Yahshua. Many might try to argue that alien crowds from Idumea and alien crowds from the cities of Tyre and Sidon were being gathered and healed by Christ. But history would suggest that at least most of this crowd, most of this great multitude, would have consisted of Israelites. That's why it's important to be familiar with the history. The accounts of the Bible did not transpire in a vacuum. So, to best understand what is happening here, to best understand who is coming to Christ, we will summarize these places much how we summarized the sects in our previous commentary, keeping up with that historical focus of the previous episode. Now, of course, the region of Galilee was the base of Yahshua's ministry. That's where he called most, if not all, of his apostles. And so his deeds would have, of course, been more intimately known in Galilee than anywhere else. Both Galilee and Perea, which was a region across the Jordan, they were at this time a tetrarchy under the rule of the tetrarch Herod Antipas. A tetrarch is a ruler of a fourth. And Herod Antipas, he answered to Rome, but had a good measure of autonomy in how he governed. Crowds like these mentioned in Mark would have certainly troubled Herod Antipas, as he is later recorded in the Gospel as fearing that John the Baptist, whom he killed, had risen from the dead. Judea was different from Galilee. It was not a tetrarchy, but it was a province under the direct governance of Rome, either through a prefect or a proconsul, such as Pontius Pilate during the ministry of Christ. The high priests, who were once appointed by the Herods, were at this time appointed and regulated by the Romans. And the Sanhedrin, which means council, they often conducted themselves in fear of that heavy Roman shadow. John 11:48, for example. The province encompassed the regions of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea, and we're going to get to Idumea. Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the center of religious life. One reason being that the men of Israel were required to present themselves before Yahweh at the temple 3 times a year. And this is not well understood, but the temple was expressly rebuilt so that the Messiah could fulfill those laws, among others, during his earthly life. This is evident in Daniel 9, which also prophesied of the temple's destruction. And that destruction was accomplished by the kinsmen avenging Romans. They destroyed the city as vengeance for the murder of Christ, and they destroyed the temple because its existence was no longer necessary after Yahshua's victory. So, therefore, any Judaized Christian who praises the idea of another temple being built, they spit on Christ. Jerusalem was also where sacrifices were regularly offered and conducted by the priests, the quote-unquote priests, because many of them were illegitimate and not actually Levites. For example, see Yahshua's distinction at Luke 10 in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he distinguishes a priest and a Levite from each other, when in reality it should be the same thing. he is showing the circumstances of the time. The city of Jerusalem was heavily mixed, and that is implied in the terror of its denizens when they heard that the Messiah was born. Matthew 2, they were terrified along with Herod the Great, Herod the quote-unquote great, and later at Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD, Josephus notes that it was filled with some of the most contemptible kinds. There is a reason why Yahshua concentrated his ministry in the countryside, as that was where most genuine Israelites were to be found, as is the case today. If you want to help your brethren in Illinois, you're more inclined to go to a small town in Illinois than Chicago. If you want to help brethren in New York, you're more inclined to go to a small village in New York rather than New York City. Now, Idumea. That's the big one here, but it's really not a big deal at all. Idumea was south of Judea, but it should not be confused with the location of the land of Edom in the Old Testament, as its borders began to gradually move northward into Judea after the Babylonian deportations and through the Persian period. This absorption was prophesied of in the 34th and 35th chapters of Ezekiel. And at the time of the Maccabees, many formerly Judahite cities actually had to be won back from the Edomites, such as Dora, which was Dor in the Old Testament, and Marissa, which was Marishah in the Old Testament. By Mark's time, the regional boundaries of Idumea were fully absorbed into what was formerly southern Judah. You just have to look at any map of the time. And so, the reference to Idumea here in Mark should not be confused whatsoever with ancient Edom. The northernmost boundaries of Idumea, Edom, in ancient times were south of the Dead Sea. The northernmost point was south of the Dead Sea, and yet Idumea's southernmost border in the first century was north of the Dead Sea. Mark is at least in part poetically illustrating how many multitudes of Israel were being gathered from as far as the southernmost point of Judea and as north as Tyre and Sidon. Now, of course, a higher concentration of Edomite serpents in Idumea is evident in the pages of Josephus, and surely lent to that name being retained for the region. And that is actually a good hypothesis as to why there is no reference of Christ ever ministering in Idumea, as far as I know. But we have to remember that the demographics of shifting nations can rarely ever be weighed in absolutes, and that pockets of genuine, unadulterated Israelites would have remained in the land which was once southern Judah. Not to mention that people were mobile and that Israelite families might have moved into Idumea from the north over the generations. Such children of Israel from what was once southern Judah would be those who were gathering themselves to Yahshua and being healed by him here. He expressly came, as he said, for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he routinely exposed the Edomites as the race of vipers which they are. He wasn't healing vipers. The betrayer, Judas Iscariot, was also an Edomite vessel of destruction. And we will discuss him in our next commentary. Yahshua had no pity for him. To summarize, it is the geographical location of Idumea being referred to, which was once southern Judah, and not the actual race of Idumeans, who were not even distinguished as Idumeans anymore, ever since they were circumcised by Hyrcanus and accounted as Judeans in the apostate eyes of the people several generations earlier. They would not even be called Edomites. They were accounted as Judeans, and they were spread everywhere throughout Judea at this time. They were spread throughout Galilee, Judea, Samaria, across the Jordan, Tyre and Sidon. They were spread everywhere, and Yahshua constantly exposed them. As John wrote in the 2nd chapter of his gospel, he didn't require for anyone to testify concerning a man because he knew what was in a man. He knew whether or not someone was a racial wheat or a racial tare. He knew it. Now, as for the people coming from across the Jordan flows from the Sea of Galilee to the north and empties into the Dead Sea at the south. And on its east were the regions at this time of the Decapolis, which means 10 cities, and Perea, which literally means a cross, related to the word here in Mark for a cross, where it says across the Jordan, which is Paran, Strong's 4008. Much of this area was inhabited by Israelites in ancient times, such as the tribes of Gad and Reuben and Moab, and the half-tribe of Manasseh in Bashan and Gilead. Joshua is recorded as having done works in the land across the Jordan, such as when he healed the dumb man in Decapolis, one of the very few miracles which are unique to Mark's Gospel, Mark 7:31. It'll be fun when we get to that one. He is also recorded as having traveled through Jericho and Perea near the end of his ministry, where he opened the eyes of Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, and his companion, and also dined with Zacchaeus, the God-fearing tax collector, whom he identified as a descendant of Abraham. A descendant of Abraham in Jericho, Zacchaeus was just a sample of the larger picture of Judeans who would have spread back into these lands over the generations after the return from exile, especially during the Maccabean period when they waxed strong and reconquered these places and regained these lands. And also the people would have spread back out through the accessible movement as a unified Roman province. The 42,000 which returned from Babylon had swelled into a very large population, as evidenced in the writings of Josephus, and there is no doubt that they had spread back out throughout all these lands. The miracles and signs which Christ performed in these places, they confirm an Israelite presence because he indeed only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The final 2 locations mentioned here in Mark are the cities of Tyre and Sidon, which were described as Phoenician by the Greeks, but no such word is found in the Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, because the very word Phoenician is of Greek origin and reflective of a Hellenistic perspective. It was not an ethnic description, but a geographical one, much like the label Syrian. This is the reason why Mark, having a Latin or Greek audience for his gospel, later identifies the Canaanite woman geographically as a Syro-Phoenician, as she dwelled in the land which the Greeks called Phoenicia. Matthew, meanwhile, uses the more accurate racial designation, Canaanite, in his Hebrew-oriented gospel, but that was a word unfamiliar to the Greeks. The testimony of Scripture, as it is compared with other historical records, is that the people of ancient times, whom the Greeks called Phoenicians, were in fact Israelites. The cities of Tyre and Sidon are treated as Israelite cities in the Old Testament, such as when they were included in David's census of Israel and distinguished apart from the, quote, cities of the Hivites and of the Canaanites. Such a distinction confirms their identity. Then, if that was not already clear enough, we read later in the scriptures concerning his son, that, quote, Solomon held a feast, and all Israel with him, a great congregation, from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. The entering in of Hamath was where the Orontes River met the Mediterranean. So therefore it is evident that the entirety of Phoenicia was in the possession of Israel during the days of Solomon. You're going right down that coast of Phoenicia. Speaking of Solomon, Hiram, king of Tyre, worked faithfully with both him and his father David. And Hiram was described by Josephus as an Israelite on both sides of his family tree. The identity of the Phoenicians is also attested to throughout the prophets, such as in the oracle against Tyre and Sidon, beginning at the 23rd chapter of Isaiah and proceeding through several of the following. Within that scroll of prophecy are exhortations for repentance and announcements of judgment, which are only applicable to the wife of Israel, who alone was given the law of the husband at Sinai. Psalm 149. If Tyre and Sidon were not Israelite cities, then they would have not received such judgment in the prophets. For as Paul said, sin is not imputed when there is no law. There are many other prophecies in those chapters which are certainly only relevant to Israel, both implicitly and explicitly. Now, it is plain in the words of the book of Joshua that the tribe of Asher inherited the cities of Tyre and Sidon. Joshua 19. And we know from other historical records that the Asherites of Tyre were never completely expelled from their city by the Assyrians or Babylonians or even by the Greeks, who had later destroyed the island city of Tyre. Tyre had a mainland and island city, the latter of which survived longer than the former. When it happened that Alexander came to destroy the island city, it is evident that many of the inhabitants had returned and spread back throughout the land during the Persian period. This endurance of the Asherites in Palestine is indicative of how Anna, the widowed prophetess who spent most of her life in the temple and who saw the Christ child in Luke 2, was able to retain the knowledge of her ancestry as an Asherite. Now, if there was an Asherite woman in Jerusalem when Christ was an infant, how many more would be in Tyre and Sidon? Much later in his earthly life, Yahshua Christ would, during his ministry, journey into the area of those cities on at least one occasion. We should not expect vain effort from our prince. Just as we said before, Christ would not have traveled somewhere unless there were Israelites to proclaim to. We discussed the exclusivity of the gospel in our presentation, the gospel for whom? The gospel for white Israel. So, with these historical matters being plainly evident, it is no surprise to see people from Tyre and Sidon gathering to see Yahshua. It's an interesting circumstance, which is only found in this passage of the gospel accounts. Mark 3:8, Luke 6:17. The identity of the Phoenicians has been expounded on at length by William Fink, our friend, of Christogenea, and we recommend his papers on the subject for any reader who is interested in learning further. There is no doubt that at least the majority of the people gathering to Christ here were Israelites, and if there were any dogs among them, their peering was vanity. For as Christ said, it is not good to take the bread of the children and cast it to the little dogs. Continuing with Mark. Mark 3:9. And he spoke to his students in order that a boat should be waiting ready for him, for reason that the crowd would crush him. Yeah, phenomenal ministry indeed. This verse is actually unique to Mark. The crowd knew that touching Christ would heal them of their ailments, and so they anxiously pressed upon the beacon of their hope. This is implied in the following verse of Mark, but it is more explicit in Luke, where we read, "And all the crowd sought to touch him, because power comes out from him and heals all." To witness someone be miraculously healed of a mere touch would compel all those watching to reach out towards Yahshua with a swelling fervor of desperation. We're all aware of how quickly a crowd can become electrified with excitement. Think of all those videos of people during Black Friday. It's unfortunate that people get so excited over consumerism and not over Christ. But they will. Everyone will understand. All of Israel is saved. Everyone will swell around him. Now Luke's language in his parallel account where he wrote that power comes out from him and heals all is reminiscent of how Luke later describes the woman with the flow of blood. Luke chapter 8 verses 45 to 46. And Yahshua said, "Who has grabbed me?" Then all denying, Petrus said, "Master, the crowd constrains and presses upon you." Then Yahshua said, "Someone has grabbed me, for I know that power has gone out from me." So that's interesting. Such power was coming out from Christ here. Returning to Mark, the word translated here as crush is thlibo, Strong's 2346. Fun word, thlibo, which is to compress or straighten. With so many needy hands reaching out from the crowd to touch even the fringe of his garment, it would have been difficult in an earthly sense for Yahshua to slip away and prepare the boat himself. And so he commands his students to have one ready for him. The people were pressing around him, constraining him, with at least 6 to 9 of the apostles being fishermen, as we explored in our commentary proclaiming the message. We can imagine that they would have been quite experienced indeed with preparing and maneuvering boats. Christ and his company would at times ferry themselves across the Sea of Galilee, such as in the next chapter of Mark 4, where we read, "He was in the vessel, and other vessels were with his, and they were sailing across to the region of the Gadarenes." The word translated as boat here is pleiarion, Strong's 4142, and is a presumed derivative of ploion, Strong's 4143. The latter is often translated as vessel in the Christogenea New Testament, as the word has no specificity towards size, and boat would probably not do the word enough justice in an English-speaking mind. The apostles are recorded as having fished in a ploion, and a 2,000-year-old vessel, likely very similar to the ones they employed, was discovered in Galilee. This vessel was discussed in the September-October 2004 issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, and was measured as being approximately 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and over 4 feet high. I wouldn't call that a mere boat. It's something in between. But this word in Mark is not ploion, it's pleiarion, a diminutive form of ploion, and seems to infer a smaller vessel. Liddell and Scott providing the interpretation of a skiff or a boat. Therefore, in 2 out of its 6 appearances in the CNT, pleiarion, it is translated as boat, because in those instances it does seem appropriate for the context. Now, this is not the only record of Yahshua requesting a vessel for reason of a pressing and constraining crowd. Because again, we can read from Luke, this time, chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. "And it came to pass, with the crowd pressing upon him then, to hear the word of Yahweh, that he was standing by the lake Gennesaret." Now that's a Greek derivation of the Hebrew Kinnereth, the ancient Hebrew name for the Sea of Galilee. "That he was standing by the lake Gennesaret, and he saw 2 vessels stationed by the lake, and the fishermen disembarked from them washing the nets. And boarding one of the vessels, which was Simon's, he asked him to set out a little from the land, and sitting, he taught the crowds from the vessel." So here in Mark 3, it's not the first time Yahshua boarded a vessel because of a pressing crowd. The boat in that instance of Luke served 2 purposes that can be seen. 1, it allowed Yahshua to not be thronged upon by the crowd, while 2, it also provided a secure and visible place for Christ to teach the crowd from. Yahshua's practice of teaching from boats is also evident in Mark 4, the next chapter of Mark's Gospel, where we read, quote, "And again he began to teach by the sea, and a very large crowd gathers to him. So as for him boarding into a vessel to sit in the sea, and all the crowd was by the sea upon the land. It was not uncommon for Joshua to teach from a vessel. And it's hard to imagine that Christ entered the boat here and then sat silent as the crowds gazed earnestly upon him. That's hard to imagine. I would really doubt that if he boarded the vessel, he just sat there and did nothing. Having been accustomed to teaching by the sea, this might also have contributed as to why Joshua departed in this direction to the east from Capernaum and did not go west instead. Especially if this all transpired on the same Sabbath day as when he healed the man in Capernaum with the withered hand. Because people were eager to learn and hear the expounding of Scripture on Sabbath days. Those were the days on which they were accustomed to being taught. So if this was all on the same Sabbath day, Joshua likely went to the Sea of Galilee so he could continue teaching the crowds from a vessel. Such a habit for teaching from vessels might have even been subtly suggested in the previous chapter of Mark, in Mark 2, where again leaving Capernaum, we read, quote, "And he went out again by the sea, and all the crowd came with him, and he taught them." Mark doesn't mention if Christ went on a boat or not, but it's quite possible indeed. Now Joshua, he was always accustomed to teaching the crowds which came to him, as we read in Mark's 10th chapter, where he writes, quote, "And arising from there he goes into the borders of Judea, and on the other side of the Jordan. And the crowds again come together to him, and as he is accustomed, again he taught them." As he is accustomed. The nourishing teachings which Joshua gave to people can be understood to have been a reward for having sought him out. Luke also records Joshua as having given the Sermon on the Plain, perhaps the Sermon on the Mount, around this time in Mark 3. The sermon being given on or near the base of the mountain, which Joshua ascends and names his apostles in the next passage of Mark. And Luke writes that, quote, "A great multitude of people from all of Judea and Jerusalem and the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him." So it is likely that Joshua proceeded to teach from the vessel, perhaps with a discourse which eventually led to his imminent sermon on the base of a nearby mountain. He had also already been healing many from various ailments before boarding the vessel. And so unlike the hired hands, which we discussed in our previous commentary, who left the sheep ignorant and bruised, the good shepherd nourished the flock with both teachings and deeds. He was healing them and teaching them. We see that through a compounding of Mark and Luke. Continuing with Mark. Mark 3:10, "For he had healed many, so as to fall upon him as many as had afflictions, in order that they may touch him." These people were falling upon Joshua with hopes to touch him and be healed. Much like the man with the withered hand from before in the previous account, who reached out towards the true vine, Christ, and was restored. So it's always interesting to see the thematic parallels in how certain accounts in the gospel are paired together. There is usually always something new to find. Will we ever touch the bottom of a well of wisdom so deep? I'm sorry for the pun. I'm sorry. Okay. We could conjecture that at least some of these being healed were those among the Galileans who followed Christ out of the assembly hall, who had a desire to likewise be lifted from their own infirmities, much like the man with the withered hand. This begs the question of how many of these wondrous healings of individuals among the crowds took place on that same Sabbath day as the one where the man was healed with the withered hand. Even if it were only a handful, a possibility which is in no way at conflict with the text, then what an awesome and authoritative show of power to Joshua's enemies. The Pharisees and Herodians had groaned over one single miracle in the Capernaum assembly hall. And then look here, Joshua goes on and unleashes a wave of spectacular signs. That is strength. They weren't going to stop him. The strength of our prince is also demonstrated in an account which Luke records from nearer to the end of his ministry. That one connected with Herod Antipas himself, and not just the Herodians. We quoted this in our previous commentary. Luke 13, verses 31 to 33. At that hour some Pharisees came forward, saying to him, "Depart, and go thence, because Herod desires to slay you." And he said to them, "Going, you say to that fox, Behold, I cast out demons and shall accomplish cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I am finished. But it is necessary for me, today and tomorrow, and on the following to proceed, because it is not allowed that a prophet is to be slain outside of Jerusalem." So at that later time, Joshua valiantly continued on his march to accomplish cures for his people, despite the gnashing of that fox Herod Antipas. And here also he continued to heal the flock, despite the gnashing of the pack of Herodians. This is why Yahweh is a rock that his children can rely on. There is no enemy that could ever take away his love from us or cause his promises to fail. The Pharisees and Herodians did not slow him down or even perturb him, as he is the Almighty God, and he victoriously continued on for the sake of his people. As Paul of Tarsus said most eloquently, according to the wisdom given to him in his epistle to the Romans, quote, "I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor messengers, nor magistrates, nor present nor future, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor any other creation will be able to separate us from the love of Yahweh, which is in Christ Joshua, our Prince." To compound on how as many who touched Joshua were saved, we have already cited the account of the woman with the flow of blood who reached out to grasp the hem of Joshua's garment, and she was healed. But we do not cite the account of Joshua's works in Gennesaret. This is from Mark 6, verse 56, but also parallel to Matthew 14:36. Quote, "And wherever he entered into a village or into a city or into the farms, in the marketplaces they set down those who are sick, and they exhorted him in order that if they could even touch the border of his garment, and as many as touched him were saved." Just as we're seeing here in Mark 3. As we discussed at detail 2 commentaries ago in regards to the man with the withered hand, I am convinced that these testimonies of crowds being healed by merely touching Christ are also symbolically compounded with the words of Yahweh in Genesis, where he says, "Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." That's an invitation, not a prohibition, an invitation for him to put forth his hand. The word for lest in Hebrew can bear that meaning. Christ is the true vine, as he himself stated, and now many are reaching out towards him, touching him, and being saved. In a temporal sense, being healed of their temporal afflictions, which is a type of the salvation of all of Israel and all of Adam in the eternal sense. Now, there is an important distinction in language between this verse and the next. It's an important distinction. It's subtle, but it's quite telling. Because in the next verse, we will read that those with unclean spirits, quote, fell before him. Fell before him. That Greek word is prospipto. Strong's 4363. It's the word from which we get the English prostrate, such as in to lie prostrate. And prospipto is defined by Liddell and Scott, among other things, as to fall before or supplicate. Now those circumstances in verse 11 might seem identical to how the crowds fell here in verse 10, but the word here in verse 10 is a different word, epipipto, which is similar, of course, epipipto, Strong's 1968, but it has a meaning more inclined towards falling upon or over. The distinction is subtle, yet literally accurate in the CNT, where epipipto is fall upon at verse 10, fall upon. Prospipto at verse 11 is fall before. So verse 10, fall upon. Verse 11, fall before. Verse 10 demonstrates how the crowds of people sought to fall upon Yahshua and touch him, as opposed to the unclean spirits in verse 11, which fell before him and made supplication in fear, begging for mercy, crying out that he is the Son of Yahweh. The people among the multitude falling upon Yahshua, once again, evocative language which we have grown to expect from Mark, as the word often implies a degree of passion or eagerness. Epipipto. Moving on the topic of Greek, the word translated as affliction here in Mark 3:10 is mastix, Strong's 3148, which is literally a whip or a scourge, but metaphorically an affliction or a plague. This word and its Hebrew equivalents are often used to represent chastisement from Yahweh God. For example, look at Job 21:9 and Psalm 32:10 in the Septuagint. Now, this word, its verbal form, is used by Paul of Tarsus in his epistle to the Hebrews, where he cites Proverbs 3, verses 11 to 12. And we'll read from Hebrews 12, verses 5 to 6. And you have utterly forgotten the exhortation which with you, as sons, he converses. Quote, my son, this is Proverbs, my son, do not esteem lightly the discipline of Yahweh, nor faint being censured by him. For whom Yahweh loves he disciplines, and he scourges. Mastigao, Strong's 3146, of course related to mastigs here in Mark 3:10. And he scourges every son whom he receives. With scourging and stripes often representing chastisement from Yahweh God for transgressions among the sons of Israel. Perhaps the healing of these afflictions, scourges among the people, is an evocative type which uses the intimately physical element of the people falling upon Yahshua to symbolically illustrate how Yahshua carried their errors on his body upon the cross. 1 Peter 2:24. And so as we read in the famous 53rd chapter of Isaiah, from which Peter quoted 1 Peter 2:24, Isaiah 53, verses 4 to 6, speaking of Christ, of course, the man of sorrows, his first advent. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So he carried those errors upon his body on the cross. The scourging of the people was upon him. Scourging is chastisement. And the purpose of chastisement is to bring one to repentance, which is obedience to the law. And obedience to the law brings peace, so chastisement is meant to bring peace. Therefore, as it says, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, symbolized by those with scourges, a type for chastisement, touching Christ here, putting it upon him. Where it is written, and Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is symbolized in the crowds falling upon Joshua. As David wrote in the Psalms, where the same word found here in Mark is used in the Septuagint translation, Psalm 39 verses 10 to 11 from the Septuagint. But we're referring to the Masoretic numbering. Okay, Psalm 39, 10 to 11 from the Septuagint. Remove your scourges, same Greek word, from me. I have fainted by reason of the strength of your hand. You chastise man with rebukes for iniquity, and you make his life to consume away like a spider's web. Nay, every man is disquieted in vain. Pause. Selah. As we discussed in our commentary on Mark, titled Plastering the Bruises, Joshua came to heal the wounds of his people Israel, and we again see a figure for that here. But the lifting away of the permanent stripes of death from the wife of Israel's body should not be taken to mean that her members were not to receive temporal blows thereafter. The curse of the law was that no man could keep it perfectly. That's the curse of the law, which Paul refers to in Galatians 3. And the husband, Christ, redeemed the wife, Israel, from that curse and all its penalties through his sacrifice on the cross, since Yahweh's death nullified the marriage and all its contracts. We spoke on that in our commentary, Fasting for the Bridegroom. However, just because we are released from the penalty of death in letters does not mean that we are not any more chastised in temporal ways for our sins, through the fiery trials of life which Yahshua Christ described as Gehenna. This is why Paul's quotation of the Proverbs was still relevant. He wrote, "For whom Yahweh loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives." The prince himself later upheld the eternal truth of those words, where he warned in his revelation, quote, "I, as many as I should love, I censure and I discipline. Therefore be zealous and repent." For whom Yahweh loves, he disciplines. Christ says, "I, as many as I should love, I censure and I discipline." Christ is Yahweh. So the permanent stripes of death upon the race are healed without exception. But many of the unrepentant individuals among her, the race, will still be battered and bruised with fiery trials by the Master. That is the lot they have chosen. But only sons are chastised, because only the sons of Israel were given the law. As Paul said in that same passage of Hebrews, which we have now twice cited, "But if you are without discipline, of which you all have become partakers, then you are bastards and not sons." If we take that into account, then there is a symbolic juxtaposition being established here in this type of the Gospel of Mark. The sons of Israel, with the scourges they received, fell upon Joshua for the healing of their bruises. But bastard spirits have no right nor capacity to fall upon Joshua. There is no hope or consolation for an unrighteous race, as Solomon said. And all they can do is fall before him, not upon him, before him, in terrified supplication. Continuing with Mark 3:11. And the unclean spirits, when they saw him, fell before him and cried out, saying that you are the Son of Yahweh. We discussed unclean spirits at great length in our commentary on Mark, titled Perturbing the Devils, where we substantiated the testimonies of the Enoch fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls with the body of Scripture, and demonstrated that the other races do not have the Adamic spirit on account of their different and corrupt flesh. Bastards are unclean vessels, as Scripture informs us, and therefore bastardization is the only source of unclean spirits in a world where everything Yahweh made is good. The pragmatic truth which this conveys is that the unclean bastard races are embodied demons, and that demons are disembodied bastards. That the unclean bastard races are embodied unclean spirits, and that unclean spirits are disembodied unclean bastard races. The origin of unclean spirits should not be perplexing to those who understand that the mystery of iniquity is rooted in corruption of the flesh, in racial corruption. Now, sometimes the only way to tell the spirits apart, of course, is through their fruits, which is why John wrote, quote, "Beloved, do not have trust in every spirit, but scrutinize whether the spirits are from of Yahweh, because many false prophets have gone out into society." Those false prophets warned of by Peter and Jude. We discussed those in our recent discussions with our friend White and also Hannibal. A family tree is known by its fruits, and the gift of being able to discern someone's racial origin through their behavior is what Paul described as the dissolution of spirits. The words of the Apostle John there are proof of this, because he's telling men to keep their eyes open on the fruits of others, to discern their family tree, to discern their racial origin. A family tree is known by its fruits, and by discerning a family tree, John explains that you discern a spirit, which must mean that bastards of bad family trees have unclean spirits inside of them. What does this tell you? That unclean spirits are disembodied bastards, and that bastards are embodied unclean spirits. The words of John the Apostle are an important witness of this fact. That was a digression. Going back to Mark. These unclean spirits, being rooted in corruption, have no hope before the God who has promised to uproot every plant which he did not plant. Now, as we have discussed, prospipto, Strong's 4363, is defined by Liddell and Scott, among other things, as to fall upon or supplicate. Supplicate. And later in the Gospel of Mark, we will see another enemy of God falling before him and making supplication. That is, the Canaanite woman. This time, not a disembodied demon, but an embodied demon, where it reads, quote, "But immediately a woman, hearing about him, of whom her daughter had an unclean spirit, having come, fell, prospipto, to his feet." She's making supplication. Matthew, in his account, uses a related yet stronger word to describe this dog's supplication, which is proskuneo, Strong's 4352, which is essentially to lie prostrate. We will explore the topic of supplication in the ancient world once we reach that portion of the commentary, Yahweh willing. That will be Mark 7. For now, it should suffice to say that the role of the suppliant in the ancient world was for a weaker individual or a conquered individual to recognize the authority of another to whom they were subject and to entreat them for mercy. This was the evident objective of all these unclean spirits who fell before Christ, crying out and begging to be spared from their promised destruction. Luke's account of the legion among the Gadarenes is a good example. Luke 8:28. And seeing Joshua crying out, he fell down, prospipto, before him, and in a loud voice he said, "What is there with me and with you, Joshua, son of Yahweh the highest? I beg you, do not torment me." That is supplication. But Yahweh cannot and will not act outside of the boundaries which he himself has set in his law and in his promises. The destruction of the unclean spirits, both disembodied and embodied, at the end of the age is a certainty which Yahweh will not relent of. There is no forgiveness for bastard spirits, both disembodied and embodied, as we see later in this chapter of Mark, at Mark 3:29, and that will be fun to get to. One last thing. We see here that these unclean spirits recognized that Yahshua was the prophesied Son of Yahweh. They're falling before him and crying out, saying, "You are the Son of Yahweh." Well, as James wrote, "You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe it, and they shudder." Which is why they're making supplication. They're terrified. But in all of the accounts of the gospel where the unclean spirits recognized him, it was meaningless, and Christ never pitied them just because they acknowledged his authority. There is no place for these wicked corruptions in his order, apart from being temporary tools of chastisement upon his sons whom he loves. Many times when we're chastised with the alien races. We see that in the curses of disobedience in Deuteronomy. And their supplications, the supplications of these corrupt races, they will be vain at the consummation of the age when the chastisement is over. So at that time, they will be destroyed. Continuing with Mark and finishing this account, this pericope, Mark 3:12. And he admonished them often that they should not make him known. This verse is unique to Mark. Now there have already been 2 accounts thus far in Mark of Yahshua admonishing the unclean spirits to be silent whenever they cried out that he is the Christ. Mark 1:25. And Yahshua admonished him, saying, "Be silent, and come out from him." And Mark 1:34. And he healed many being ill with various diseases, and he cast out many demons. Yet he did not allow the demons to speak, because they knew him to be the Christ. The pattern of unclean spirits and their interactions with Yahshua is quite consistent throughout the gospel. It seems that they would always immediately recognize that Yahshua was the Christ upon seeing him, and then they would cry out in terror, sometimes after running up and making obeisance. They would adjure Yahweh to have mercy on them, or simply just lament their coming woes, testifying to his authority and identity, to which he would admonish them to be silent, as he does so here. So these interactions were clockwork, and thus Mark notes that, quote, he admonished them often. Often, because all these unclean spirits are seeing him and saying the same thing, running up to him, making supplication as they shudder, as James says. It's clockwork. And so they did it often, and Yahshua admonished them often. And such admonishment is a display of how Yahshua's sovereign authority reaches even as far as to the elements of this world which he did not create. As we read in the opening chapter of Mark, quote, this is the people in the assembly hall of Capernaum speaking in amazement where he healed the possessed man in that assembly hall. Quote, and he commands the unclean spirits, and they obey him. So the unclean spirits are obeying Yahshua, even though Yahshua, as Yahweh, did not make the unclean spirits. Then in Luke's parallel account of that event, quote, what an account this is! For that with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they depart. Yahweh certainly has authority and power over all things, which is why the key to the bottomless pit is illustrated in Revelation as coming from him. As for why Yahweh ordered the silence of these unclean spirits, we will repeat some of what we said in our commentary on Mark, perturbing the devils. It is evident in the Gospels that Yahshua did not want the people at this time to publicly know that he was the Christ, such as where we read in the first chapter of Mark, quote, and he cast out many demons, yet he did not allow the demons to speak because they knew him to be the Christ. Because they knew him to be the Christ. The prince even urged his apostles to keep that identity a secret, such as when he, quote, ordered the students in order that they would tell no one that he is the anointed one. Christos means anointed. So that they would tell no one that he is the Christ. He didn't want the people to know. The reason for these admonitions is, for example, made evident in Yahshua's withdrawal to the mountain after the feeding of the 5,000, where John writes in his record of that event, and that details only in John, quote, "Then the men, seeing the sign of the feeding of the 5,000, the many loaves and fish, seeing the sign which he had made, said that this is truly the prophet who is coming into the society." They're referring to the prophet in Deuteronomy 18. Yahshua, knowing that they were going to come and to seize him in order that they would make him king, he alone withdrew back into the mountain. The plain matter is this: if the people became abundantly aware that Yahshua was the Christ, then they would have sought to make him king. And such widespread and zealous approval would have prevented his necessary crucifixion at the hands of the high priests. They could not make him king. Not yet. It was necessary that his identity not become publicly known, so that the children of Israel could be saved from their errors. And even some of their hearts were hardened, so that by enclosing them in disobedience, the merciful preservation of the nations of Israel could be achieved. Paul explains that in his epistle to the Romans. So, Yahshua kept his identity a secret, as Paul wrote to the Philippians, yet he made himself of no account. But of course, when the time was coming, when that hour was approaching, when he would lay down his life on behalf of the sheep, he allowed the people during his triumphal entry into Jerusalem to proclaim that he is the Messiah, that he is the King, the Son of David. He allowed them in that instance because the hour was coming. This concludes this commentary on Mark. Looking forward to the next passage, we can see how this account of Christ healing ailments and casting out demons precedes the naming of his ambassadors on the mountain. And to keep up with that thematic organization of the Gospels, which we always try to look for, this could be interpreted as foreshadowing how Yahshua would send off his apostles to do the very same things. As we read from Yahshua's instructions to his apostles in Matthew, quote, "Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely you must give." So here, before ascending the mountain, Yahshua is healing the sick and casting out demons. Then he ascends the mountain and gives his apostles instructions to do the same. In our next commentary, Yahweh willing, we will discuss the apostles and the purpose they had in this ongoing story of life. Thank you for watching, and praise Yahweh, the God of Israel.
It's so